The need for cultural relevance in education is now more pronounced in the face of current advancements in science and information technology. This has the emerging generation of growing children more versed in idioms of the US and Europe at the expense of their home culture. Hi, my name's Daniel Lee. I'm from the University of Tasmania and I'm presenting a paper on the role of music education in cultural preservation, perpetuation and development in 21st century digital environments. It is well understood that music plays a significant role in cultural identities all over the world, past and present. Celebrations and events exemplified by religious occasions, commemorative events, weddings, parties, annual celebrations, and of course the presence of music in various roles within education demonstrate the significance of music in cultures. Akuno's alarm in my opening statements concerns music education in Nigeria. This paper proposes there is a similar act of cultural sacrifice also occurring in Australian music education, where imported musics are being taught at the expense of local cultural capital. I will be reporting findings from my PhD study conducted investigating education practices in tertiary contemporary popular music courses, and I'll discuss the role of music education in a potential symbiotic relationship between the processes of cultural preservation, perpetuation and development. The primary perspective is framed by UNESCO's 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage and applied to Australian contemporary popular music with a specific focus on guitar performance practices. To correctly set the framework for this paper, definitions of cultural preservation, perpetuation and development need to be clarified. Cultural preservation refers to maintaining cultural practices, and a topical example would be a guitar student learning to perform a note-for-note transcription of an historic Australian guitarist's performance. Cultural perpetuation refers to continuing the idiomatic styles and could include a guitar student performing a personal stylized cover version of an existing contemporary popular music composition. Cultural development refers to creation of new material from an understanding of existing cultural capital and could include a guitar student composing a new song deliberately incorporating stylistic idioms. This could also occur unintentionally as musicians create new material from their own knowledge base and skill set, which is inherently influenced by local cultural heritage. So what does the literature say on this topic? UNESCO claim culture is transmitted from generation to generation and is constantly recreated in response to the environment and to artists' histories. Culture is something of which practitioners and observers alike are an active part and which develops as they cultivate their practices and aesthetic aptitudes. Artists typically create new art by developing their style according to their cultural inheritance, thereby, in turn, further evolving their culture while exploring each individual's expression. Culture develops as people and people groups cultivate their practices and aesthetic aptitudes. It is therefore typically a cyclically evolving process of which practitioners, educators and observers alike are all active parts. Artists usually create new art by developing their style in accordance with their cultural inheritance, thereby, in turn, further evolving their culture while exploring their own individual expression. In this way, musicians, including Australian music students, are not simple passive consumers of culture, but proactive and deliberate creators of fresh cultural capital. In his study regarding the notion of cultural sustainability, Titon constructed a list of elements that may contribute to perpetuation. These include the circulation of music, how it is sold and consumed, the transmission of music from person to person, generation to generation, particularly through education, musical rights and ownership, the internal strength of music cultures, the roles of community and cultural heritage. After exploring ideas around preservation and revivification, he concluded that living heritage masterpieces are best maintained by managing the cultural soil surrounding them. Ochere examined the history of music teaching in Ghanaian schools, analysing the curriculum content of 2 Ghanaian universities. He observed colonial music was the dominant curricula and recommended the development of a multicultural music program with foci on African musics for the purpose of cultural revivification. Music education programs with specific intent of cultural maintenance have been researched and developed in many non-Western countries, including Malaysia, Grenada, and Thailand. In his discussion on the role of universities within developing societies, DiMaggio stated, "The old universities had a specific cultural role in that they trained specialists in high culture, established and renewed canons in several art forms, and inculcated in students an awareness and respect for the products of high culture worlds." Blackwood, also discussing higher education with a focus on the inflection point for cultural renewal, stated, "We need new institutions of higher education so we can give a rebirth to the past." It is evident from the literature that curriculum designers of music programs understand that they have the potential to play important roles in cultural practice. Engagement in this process is evident and indeed a growing concern within non-Western countries where forms of cultural dissolution are clear. However, there seems to be little research into the loss of geolocated subcultural idiosyncrasies within Western nations, including Australia, and the potential roles of music education in counteractions. So the methodology for my study. The scope of the study included bachelor degree courses, so Australian Qualifications Framework Level 7, where a student could major in contemporary or popular music performance with the guitar as their primary instrument. The methodology blended aspects of existing anthropological practices and can be best described as a phenomenographically oriented, multi-sited online distance comparative ethnography. To ensure validity, the methodology was independently peer-reviewed and published prior to the PhD thesis submission. Data analysis followed established protocols of inductive thematic analysis, with other methodological design influenced by research designs specific to music and music education. A 3-part data corpus was collected via online surveys with 84 participants, industry documents comprising course outlines and unit descriptors of every relevant unit of every relevant course, obtained through public access to the institution's online presences or via email. The interview dataset comprised recorded telephone interviews, primarily with self-selected participants from the surveys. The transcription process and reading the unit descriptors were found to be a valuable source of ethnographic immersion. 25 institutions offering courses that fit the scope of the study were found, and this comprised 17 universities, 5 private institutions, and 3 TAFE colleges. The most apparent finding of the study was that among the 25 courses investigated, no 2 courses were alike. There was great diversity in curriculum design, pedagogical practice, and delivery. Only a few courses examined in the study intentionally employed Australian material for the purpose of cultural engagement as described by UNESCO. Data revealed a relationship does exist between the employment of Australian material and students being concerned about an Australian voice. However, data also strongly suggested that when institutions had employed Australian material, their students did not universally engage with the material and perform it beyond the confines of the institution. This is significant because it can inform course designers who do wish their courses to actively take part in future development of Australia's contemporary popular music cultural heritage. One important issue the study encountered early on was identifying exactly what defines Australian contemporary popular music cultural heritage. Participants in this study found it difficult to precisely define Australian popular music. However, the consensus was that there is a distinct Australian sound. Samantha made an effort to articulate what she felt was the Australian sound. However, one can still sense the difficulty that she had. Further to this, Paul stated, "It's not the style as such, it's the delivery." The common thread among participants when attempting to define Australian popular music was rhythm, perhaps best exemplified by Kevin's comment, "It's the hypnotic, powerful rhythm, the rhythm guitar mainly, and other guitar playing with it to double it up." I think that's a very Australian rock approach. So, what is the role of education? Participants observed various aesthetics in Australian popular music have not necessarily been developed as a result of education. Samantha stated, "When we think about the guitar players that are looked to as being indicative of a certain stylistic aesthetic, we're often looking at people who defied that kind of blanket competency-based approach to playing. However, where the institutions were perceived to have had culturally significant influence on the local and or global music communities, it was observed that reflective practices rather than prescriptive pedagogies were noticeably more effective. An eclectic nature of course design, content and pedagogical practices was observed, particularly including the definition of genre boundaries of contemporary popular music, as exemplified by Barry's statement. This eclecticism is indicative of the nature of Australia's popular music industry and anticipated career paths for graduates and the need for the education sector to respond appropriately. For example, Alita said, "When you say genre, I try to keep it eclectic." Her attitude is driven by the realisation that most of her graduates will engage in some form of portfolio career, which will inevitably include education as at least one source of income. The research found a predominance of student-centred pedagogical approaches that have been intentionally developed by the Australian popular music higher education sector to remain relevant to the 21st century music industry rather than any cultural significance. Paul's statement highlights an approach that embraces eclecticism simultaneously with a learner-focused approach allowing for maximal autonomy. This is further exemplified by these following data extracts. UNESCO observed, the process of globalisation and social transformation give rise to grave threats of deterioration, disappearance and destruction of intangible cultural heritage. And they claim this is mainly due to a lack of resources for safeguarding such heritage. It seems apparent from this study that the physical resources do exist and the biggest issue is awareness and concern. The grave threats of deterioration may mostly be due to human resources. Participants in the study implied that contemporary popular music curriculum designs based on the Conservatoire model, albeit with concessions to popular music aesthetics, may be in danger of causing ossification, exemplified by James's statement. However, courses that do not engage with local cultural heritage are equally in danger of instigating cultural absorption into a global homogeneity with no connection to historical foundations or geographical contexts. To correctly address this issue, we must consider what the role of tertiary institutions is. Should higher education be concerned exclusively or primarily with preserving the past, or should tertiary institutions be active in developmental progress? Scruton stated that the social and moral purpose of universities has been handing on both a store of knowledge and the culture that makes sense of it. Has the role of universities, and indeed all tertiary institutions, changed in recent years? Is the role of other tertiary institutions different to that of universities? A topic for further research and discussion may be examination and redefinition of tertiary institutions and their purposes. This may differ between subjects. The perceived role of tertiary institutions by various parties in the arts may be very different to the role in other fields. Perhaps it is becoming increasingly necessary for institutions to examine their purpose and ensure it is clearly articulated in their course design. This study revealed recent developments in the tertiary sector include universities steering toward more vocational pedagogies, while vocational colleges are including increased academic foci. The distinction between university and TAFE is becoming increasingly blurred in the contemporary popular music sector. Australian popular music is a cultural melting pot. It always has been and continues to be so, with influence from local sources and immigrants' musics. This is now exacerbated in the 21st century due to developments in global communication technologies and also due to continued immigration policies. In order to align with UNESCO's Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, Australian contemporary popular music higher education would need to reflect this eclectic nature and balance acknowledgement of the past with acknowledgement of current cultural impacts, which inherently include global development in telecommunications and the subsequent broader cultural access that this brings. Some of my other earlier recent research found exemplars existing in the Australian contemporary popular music cultural capital contain equal pedagogical value to others from the global contemporary popular music canon. These local compositions could therefore be used as exemplars in both curriculum design and pedagogical practice in order to enhance exposure to, and therefore preservation of, the Australian cultural heritage. However, findings of this research suggest there is no consistent approach within the Australian popular music higher education sector regarding expectation, agreements, or even awareness of concepts concerning safeguarding Australian contemporary popular music as intangible cultural heritage and the consequent role of higher education. A broad approach to pedagogy allows for greater equity of access to higher education and greater autonomy, encouraging each student to develop an individual voice. The historical development of cultural heritage in the form of independent aesthetic signatures of Australian contemporary popular music performance styles naturally occurred in an organic fashion while Australian culture was geographically more isolated to various extents. With the advent of global telecommunications, the geographic isolation has become less of a factor and the potential for extra cultural influence has increased. For an identifiable aesthetic signature of the Australian voice in global guitar communities and popular music communities to continue to develop in exactly the same fashion as it has historically, deliberate effort must be made to disengage with cultural influence via 21st century telecommunications. Since this is unfeasible, it perhaps should be considered that the Australian voice must continue to develop by continuing to engage with extra-cultural influence using whatever naturally accessible means exist. In the 21st century, this implies engaging with telecommunications and influence via global communities of practice, as is demonstrated to be currently happening in contemporary popular music higher education here in Australia. However, for an Australian voice to remain Australian, this must also simultaneously engage with local cultural heritage as the point of departure. Translocal cultural diffusion via communication technologies has created a global cultural diffusion in the 21st century. If the unique traits of Australian contemporary popular music are not to be lost in cultural absorption, a greater awareness, leading to action within education curriculum design, pedagogy and content consideration, should be encouraged within contemporary popular music education in Australian higher education institutions. Inclusion of foundation Australian popular music content as curricular exemplars would regenerate the cultural capital and give a solid foundation for students to build new aesthetics with cultural connection to their roots. A deeper engagement with local musicians, especially Indigenous artists, will help the Australian voice in worldwide industry and communities develop a distinct accent rather than be absorbed into a global sound. The logistics regarding how these objectives could be addressed and necessary conversations around purpose and around international students are all areas open for further research into the local, global and global cultural implications of music education practices in the 21st century, both in Australia and internationally. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that presentation. If you have any questions or would like to investigate my research any further, there's my email, or you can find my research on my ResearchGate page.